The presidential election in the US is being closely watched by people across the world, not just because it impacts global politics, but also because of how entertaining this presidential race has been so far. I interviewed Allison Williams, who's a supporter of the Republican Party, and Dasheika Ruffin, who supports the Democratic Party. Both of them have worked on campaigns for the parties they support, and we spoke about a whole host of issues, starting from the policies of both Trump and Harris, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Israel's war on Gaza, and what Indians can expect from the outcome of the US elections. This is a second part of a two-part interview series. This one is with Dasheika Ruffin. But all this won't be possible without your support, so become a paid TNM subscriber by scanning the QR code on your screen and support independent journalism. Thank you so much for speaking to us. It's a very entertaining presidential race that we're all very closely following here in India. But I want to talk about your presidential candidate. The first question on everyone's mind, how will she be different? How will her tenure, if she gets elected, be different than that of President Biden?
Yeah. So thank you so much, one, for the invite and having me, and for that question. We get that asked a lot because not only is she a relic of the previous administration, she's trying to distinguish herself as separate and apart, but continuing the progress that the Biden-Harris administration enjoyed. And so the ways I feel that she will be different is she is creating her own vision, right? So when you think about President Biden's administration, it was to kind of get us out of the dark days, right? It was the emergence of the pandemic and how we return to the normal society, whatever that new normal is. And so Vice President Harris enjoys a new vision, right? It is a not going back to the dark days that got us to the pandemic and to the massive economic crisis that we're seeing, high inflation. It is a new vision for the future. And so one of the things I'm kind of seeing some similarities, it almost reminds you of 2008 with Obama coming, right? When he infused change and hope into the conversation. And so that's what you're really seeing with Vice President Harris. She is returning to the roots of strengthening the middle class. She has laid out her economic plan to do so. And so I think you're just going to see a different tone, right? It's almost like a return to civility. We have had about 8 years of just complete turmoil in our country, and while we've put band-aids on it, we haven't gotten to the root cause of those problems. And so with the Vice President Harris administration, she is really focusing on joy, hope, and just restoring democracy in our country.
While in terms of the rhetorics, it does make sense what you're saying. But, if you look at the finer details, for example, foreign policy, there's a lot that has to be explained. The way US got out of Afghanistan, the chaos they left behind. So it does seem hypocritical that you speak about human rights, but there are people who did stand by you have been left to fend for themselves, and we know what happened to them. So how would you respond to criticism that, the stated policy and what actually is practiced are very different?
Yeah, so it's a very tough line because we in the United States are very vocal on what we want, right? And coming from the Democratic Party, we are the party we're called the Big Tent Party, with like varying ideas and various viewpoints. And so to be the leader of that party, it is difficult because you're catering to a lot of perspectives. And so going to your point, you had a large demographics of our party that said, why are we in this war? One, we should have never been there, but why are our troops still, why do we still have this influence in this war? And so it's a difficult balance to be able to kind of thread when you have large issues like that, where people are just like split on what the policy should be. And so one of the things that I'm seeing, especially with Vice President Harris, she is listening to the will of the people. And so, and there's some scientific data that goes along with that. So that's how she's developing her policies. We haven't had that for a while. It's been almost like a unilateral decision by one leader, and with a disregard to the American people. And so I think that just kind of goes into the tone that she's going to bring into her administration and just her vision for the United States.
Before I get back to foreign policy, I want to pick on 2 points that you just mentioned. The essentially you're saying that she won't have a top-down approach to policy, but there is a section that views it as being indecisive, as being not clear on policy, and that's one criticism she's faced often. What is her policy? How do you counter that?
So I actually think it's not necessarily indecisiveness, it is an evolving, right? And so she talks about part of the criticism is she's kind of changed her stance on certain things. And the way that she's explained it, and I think she's explained it brilliantly, is in order for evolution and change to happen, there has to be pivots, right? There has to be opportunities to grow with, one, the will of the people. And so when you see some of the times where her position seems to be changing, she's very clear that her values have stayed the same. But she's talking to American people like being a vice president gives you a different viewpoint, right? So when you come in, she was a member of the Senate and she had one thought process, right, as the legislative body. But being in the executive branch gives you new perspectives, gives you a viewpoint that you might not have seen before. And so I think I think it might be it's beneficial because we are looked as the country that's ever evolving. I think it's important to, if you're changing your stance on stuff, let people know. You can't just change your stance and then just continue on and act like it never happened, right? So there is an accountability piece where it's incumbent on her to have conversations. And we saw that in her very first interview when she was asked about that. And so I think when you hear the people say like she's switched on issues, it's incumbent on her to give an answer of why that's happening.
Explain why.
Exactly.
Right. The second point I want to pick is about how you mentioned that your party represents a whole spectrum of people, right? That also brings the question, where would the policies go? Would it be more towards Bernie Sanders, more progressive policies or more moderate policies, with people like Biden? Where would Kamala Harris take the policies of the country?
So I think she will go with the mass of the party, which is more so in the middle. However, I do think there is some more political will to be more progressive on certain things. So, for example, we saw student loan debt and that being a major issue where initially more moderate Democrats weren't probably on the same side. And so we've seen how that issue really transformed the conversation in the election, where if you would have asked us maybe 4 years ago, a large demographic that we relied on in the Democratic Party is youth. And for most part in 2016, they weren't really with us, right? 2020, there was conversations of maybe, them staying home, but they showed out and in large numbers. And so polling showed that the last 4 years, they've kind of left the party a little bit. Some of them are single issue voters. So there are things that they really care about that they felt like wasn't being addressed. And now you're starting to see this reckoning where they're coming back to the Democratic Party. And so that's a symptom and a result of being that big party structure that talks about a lot of issues and talks to a lot of people.
What would it mean for India if Harris comes to power? Of course, there is a lot of, especially in the southern part of India, many people are almost rooting for her because they kind of relate to her Indian roots. But that said, I don't know if that is just symbolic. I don't know if it'll be substantive in terms of policy. So what can Indians expect?
So one, I'll take one aspect of that, just some pure representation, right? It goes to one, the pure dedication to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our country, right? The fact that we are putting forth our third woman who ran for president in our country, second woman to garner the support of a national party, but first Black woman, first woman of Indian descent, right? And so there is a symbolic aspect of this campaign, and specifically our candidate, where people feel a sense of pride. People see themselves in the candidate, and also just the excitement of having a different perspective when it comes to policy, right? So I'm a political operative. I have 20 years of experience, and what I've noticed is when we have people of color, specifically women, on the ballot, they legislate differently, right? The way they think about policy. It is a all-encompassing think of community when you're legislating. And so to have someone that like that at the head, the leader of our country, our commander in chief, it's an exciting time in our country. As far as the relationships with India, I mean, I've went all across India pretty much the last 2 weeks, and that is what I'm seeing, the excitement for her. And so while the United States elections have always been a topic of must-watch TV for other nations, I think there's just a sense of pride that I'm experiencing with a lot of Indians, especially in South India. As far as policy, I will say this. Generally, there are, and this kind of goes into the U.S.-Indo relations, there's generally not going to be a ton of change in policy per se. I know that India and U.S. enjoy a very strong relationship. That's not going to change regardless of our elections in November. But I definitely think that it's just like more of a symbolic aspect of a sense of pride, like an investment in seeing someone that looks like you as a leader of our country.
Right. One criticism that has come her way, specifically about her term as the vice president, is that she did not leave an impact. She couldn't, I mean, while that comes with the territory, for example, her dealing of the US-Mexico border issue has been criticized. Yes, I will concede that the way she spoke about the abortion rights, the first vice president to ever visit an abortion clinic, did leave a very strong mark. But on these other issues, she has been perceived as dilly-dallying. How do you address that?
I think it's a very unfair criticism. Again, as someone who's been in politics for over 20 years, I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns. I have never seen the level of criticism for a vice president that I have seen with Vice President Harris. Largely, the vice president position is kind of looked at ceremonial. It's you're the number 2 to the president. And so you don't get to develop your own policies. Yes, you weigh in and you're the support system for the president, but that's exactly what you are. You're the support system. And so this criticism of like day one, she doesn't have her own policies. Well, one, she didn't know she was going to be running for president 2 months ago, right? And so I think it's really unfair. The people that criticize her tenure as vice president often challenge them to name me an impactful vice president and what made them impactful. And generally, when I ask those questions, they're kind of left scrambling. So I just think that the criticism is unfair when you compare it to other vice presidents. However, I do think it is important and it is a fair criticism to ask a candidate what they're going to stand for, and they are responsible for making that decision. But criticizing someone as vice president for stances that they're there to support the president, she couldn't go on her own to do. Her job was to amplify the decisions and the choices and the perspective of the Biden-Harris administration. Notice I said Biden-Harris. She is second.
Of course. But in television interviews, when she was asked about the border issue, which was something that was given to her to handle, right? That was an opportunity to shine, to make your mark. Her comments were criticized interestingly, by both left and right, asking Central Americans to not go back. So how do you view that? Do you think that will also reflect in her policies as president if she does become one?
I'm not, because her being president and a candidate, she gets to develop her own standpoint. And so, again, I do think she was working with the administration. And so there might have been talking points or visions that she wanted to diverge from and wasn't able to because it is the Biden-Harris administration. But I definitely think that, again, this is another example of like the unfair criticism, right? So you see the Republicans kind of coined her as like the border czar, right? That she was supposed to come in and fix this issue. Our immigration system, as we know, is broken, right? it is not a quick fix. And if it was a quick fix, it would have been fixed already, right? The Biden administration put forth a comprehensive immigration legislation piece, right? That garnered, like I said, bipartisan support. It also garnered the support of a lot of people who are on the border states, right? And Donald Trump tanked that bill just for political talking points, right? And so it's kind of hard to criticize a problem where one side puts forth a solution and then you tank it just because you want something to talk about. In her position as the border czar, and I don't even want to say that because that's not what her job was supposed to be. Yeah. It was actually to study the root causes of the immigration problem and work with the individuals who are subject matter experts to put forth a comprehensive deal. And she did that. So while she gets a lot of criticism because people don't understand the full extent and role of what she was her portfolio, she completed her job. And unilaterally, she can't pass a piece of legislation, not as vice president and certainly not as president.
I know we're pressed for time, so just last couple of questions. Yeah. I want to just quickly visit her time as the AG and even before that. So one stance that's become controversial over the years is her hesitation to endorse the reforms in the criminal justice system. She had opposed the police wearing body cam. That's come up quite a few times. So is there a fear that her stance as a prosecutor of tough on law, tough on crime, and pro law and order, which could also mean against human rights? It could translate into that. Do you think that somewhere it gives room to interpret her policies differently?
Yeah. So what's very, very interesting is depending on the audience dictates the narrative, right? So I actually remember her when she was AG in California, and for certain aspects, she was looked at as very liberal. Yeah. If you go back to some of the old newspapers, it's like liberal reformer, right? And she was very popular, right? And then moving on to Senate, to U.S. Senate, she worked on a lot of policing reform legislation. She was one of the standard bearer authors for the police immunity bill. And so now that she's running for president, your record is open for discussion. Yes. But I feel like the way that people have changed her record according to whatever narrative they're trying to play. So we see this a lot. There was large discussions about her locking up Black men for marijuana legislation, right? And so when you go back and peel back the onion and look at actually, it was a federal policy that many of these men were being locked up under, right? Or a local policy. It wasn't the state policy, right? So those numbers, I think, and don't quote me, I think it was in her tenureship, 35 people who were locked up for marijuana possessions. And it was distributing marijuana. It wasn't possession, right? And so that's a way to kind of distort her record. And so now it is a conversation where she was this tough on crime, against police. And it was just well, one of the things that one of the banners that really permeated her 2020 presidential run is she was a cop. Right. And it was looked at as a negative thing. And now you're saying she hated cops. So it just doesn't make sense. And you're seeing a lot of that rhetoric. We're used to seeing that, but the use of social media helps amplify and misinformation. And so while I think it's fair to criticize people's records, it's not fair to rewrite their records. And I see a lot of that happening.
Right. I want to end with what we started with, foreign policy. Yeah. And we cannot complete this conversation without addressing the Gaza issue. Oh, yeah. Right? Yeah. Can we see a continuation of complete surrender? I'm using that very responsibly to Israel, because Biden administration has given funds, has given arms to Israel's war on Gaza, which has translated into major human rights violation. Yeah. One, she inherits that. Two, will she continue that?
Yeah, so I think, one, she has been very clear on her stance. While Israel has the right to defend themselves, Palestine has the right to exist, right? And so I think this was literally maybe day 2 of her being out on the trail. she was very clear on her stance for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. She has doubled down on that several times. And so I definitely think she is a little bit more progressive on this issue than the Biden administration. Even from the conversations where like sit down with leaders in both communities, right? So really trying to like broker a common understanding. However, one of the things, this is probably one of the issues that is dividing the Democratic Party the most. And so I'm sure you all saw earlier this year with the massive protests happening on college campuses all over the country. And so even more so, many people who feel like, one, the Biden administration hasn't gone far enough and wanted to push Harris to go a little further, which, you know, she's kind of getting there, have decided to mount like protest votes, right? So we saw earlier this year in our primary, especially in Michigan, where that has a large Muslim population, over 60,000 people decided not to pledge their support for Biden and vote uncommitted, right? There's additional people who have decided that they're not going to vote in this election. And so I definitely think this is going to be one of the defining conversations in this election. And generally, foreign policy is not one of the top issues unless we're in war. But I think this issue and also Russia, Ukraine are going to be, that have penetrated some of the top issues. And we're going to continue seeing that.
Right. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. And we'll keep a close track of what happens in the US.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.